introduce you to this V8 with the windows down. So hello, and welcome to the Mercedes-Benz SLS AMG Black Series. So before I drown you out with any more 6.2 litre V8, let's just wind up those windows one more time. What a machine, what an engine, last of the naturally aspirated V8 greats from Mercedes. But before we talk about the platform, let's just acknowledge the rarity. 150 of these cars made worldwide. That's rare. Unbelievably rare. So rare, in fact, that obviously the allocation of left-hand drive versus right-hand drive was disproportionately allocated to left-hand drive cars, making right-hand drive cars just 15 right-hand drive cars. And I believe 11 of those right-hand drive cars were allocated to the UK alone, making this a very special car indeed. This has actually come directly from Mercedes-Benz UK. It's part of their heritage fleet, so thank you so much, Mercedes-Benz, for putting this in my hands and on this channel for my wonderful audience. Anyway, so what is the SLS AMG Black Series? Well, think of the Black Series as the bridging vehicle between the regular SLS and the SLS GT3 racing car. Now, that might sound like a bit of a stretch because the GT3 racing car is incredibly hardcore. However, there is a little known fact that surrounds this car. You're probably not familiar with a company called HWA, but those guys have been running Mercedes race teams for quite some time. Think CLK GTR and Mercedes DTM cars, of which all of the above have been incredibly successful. They also run the SLS GT3 cars, and it just so happens that AMG gave this platform to HWA and it became a collaborative program. And so what you really have, what is the defining feature that stands this out from the regular SLS AMG, is that it was literally developed by the GT3 racing division. And what that makes this car is incredibly hardcore indeed. Now, another component which is interestingly exclusive to this car is indeed the tyres, which are a specifically developed Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 that ultimately resulted in this thing going around the Nürburgring in 2013 with a 7 minutes 25 second lap time. Now, while we're on the topic of tyres, because I've been working closely with Michelin over the last few years, I've bent their arm and said, wouldn't it be cool if we could put one of my audience in the passenger seat of one of these cars with me as an experience, as a sort of day in the life of Mr. JWW, and to get you along for maybe a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And Michelin, being the pioneers they are, came back to me and said, why don't we take this a step further and give them a real opportunity of a lifetime? Why don't we give a lucky somebody the opportunity during the Goodwood Festival of Speed to join you for a drive up the hill climb? So what I'm saying is, this is your chance. We have put together a competition. I'll put the link below. By the world of terms and conditions, you have to be 18 or over, I'm afraid, to enter this. But this channel started because I wanted to put as many of you as I possibly can in the passenger seat with me to experience these wonderful cars. Well, now we can literally physically put one of you guys in the passenger seat with me for a drive up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. Michelin are the title sponsor of the supercar paddock. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, that's basically where the action is at. And this year, it's going to be the biggest supercar paddock that Goodwood have ever featured, and that's where all of the action is. So if you are lucky enough to get your name drawn out of the digital hat, as it were, we're going to be based out of the Michelin supercar paddock, and we're going to be taking a very special car up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb, and you're going to be in the passenger seat with me. How ridiculous is that? We're transitioning back onto the tyres. Interestingly, the Cup 2s on this were the first ever Cup 2s developed for AMG. And not only were they developed for AMG, they were also a very specific compound for this car, which makes them very special indeed, and as I mentioned, resulted in one hell of a lap time around the Nürburgring. So on to the engine, and what makes it so complete is that it is still the 6.2 litre V8 that was from the regular SLS AMG, but this has been tweaked somewhat and had some race components thrown in. It now revs to 8,000 RPM and is another 40 horsepower more than the regular SLS AMG, making it a colossal 631 horsepower. That's very AMG, isn't it? That's very Mercedes, 631. Then round it up, or round it down, 631. And you feel every single one of those German horses, because this now revs out to 8,000 RPM. Now the delivery of power in this car is such that you find yourself actually short shifting. It's got over 430 pounds-feet of torque, and so the way it gathers momentum is of another dimension. So I'm going to drop it down now to third, right? I mean, I shift about there. It feels like it's good to shift there. As a spot of context, that was 5,500 RPM, and it revs to 8. Listen to 8. And you're onto those carbon ceramics very quickly as a result of that 8,000 RPM red line, because you are gathering galactic speeds when it comes to this throttle being fully depressed. So back when this car was launched, certainly in the UK anyway, they were around about £230,000 for a right-hand drive version. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, right-hand drive versions are unobtainium. They are some of the rarest cars in the world. The mere fact that I'm driving one right now is like being saddled up on a unicorn. So these cars are around about £600,000 for a right-hand drive one. That is, if you can even find one. I've seen them more expensive than that, but I've also seen them around about 600,000. Left-hand drive ones are a smidge more accessible at around about the £400,000 mark. So they've almost doubled in value since 2013, and that's what specialness and rarity does to a car like this. Now back to its race car heritage and feeling. The car is around about 1,550 kilograms. Not the lightest in the world, but not bad for a car of a Grand Tourer platform. But components like an entirely titanium exhaust system, which shaved 13 kilograms from the standard car, carbon ceramic brakes, for example, the entire bonnet, or hood, depending on where in the world you're watching from, is now completely carbon fibre. In fact, under there it is a work of art. And the engine has been mounted even further back and even lower to improve the weight distribution and centre of gravity. It is so far back, in fact, that you would definitely now class this as a front mid-engined supercar, and the balance is sensational. Now when you get in it, the feeling is quite weird. The bonnet is so long, you could land an aeroplane on it. It is colossal, but it has these two very defined power domes that run along the length of it that almost look like these sort of hunting fins. I've used the fin directly in front of me to almost place myself on the road and target apexes. It's a really sculpted bonnet, but the way that this thing turns in is so surprising. Understeer is not a word that was ever uttered in the development program of this car. It is GT3 front end, without a doubt. And the other substantial component that you might have picked up on, which I'm a massive fan of, twin clutch gearbox. Have you heard this thing go through the gears? More importantly, down the gears. Seamless, smooth, rapid, full of Spitfire character. What a sound. What a wonderful, wonderful sound. Isn't that great? Now what is cool, despite the fact that this is the hardest of the hardcore AMGs, unlike the more modern day AMGs where the pops and bangs and overruns from the exhaust system have been somewhat manufactured and engineered into the driving experience, nothing wrong with it, it's just not entirely real. In this car, the pops and bangs are selective in their appearance. But like anything that's rare, it's also very special. Of course, with it being naturally aspirated and connected to 631 finely trained German ponies, the throttle response is also from another dimension. So when I'm in third gear right now, it just builds and builds and builds with like just massive linear torque. And I think that is quite a defining characteristic actually of this engine. It's linear. You look down, and the way that this car is so composed, it actually disguises its speed freakishly well. I say freakishly because upon looking down, as I just said, you look at numbers and you're like, that must be kilometers an hour. And then you realize it's not. It's just insanely, insanely fast. What I particularly like about this car is the way that you do have to learn its character traits when you're really on it. Now, the dangerous thing about this car is that it's at home when you're really on it, which means to discover said character trait, you have to be, you guessed it, really on it. And when you're really on it in this thing, you're really on it. Like so, if the corner has some undulations and bumps in it, the rear end becomes skippy. That's, you know, well-known technical automotive term for a bouncy rear end. It's just a character trait of the car. At first, it's a little bit unnerving because it feels like the back's about to snap away, but it's not. It's actually just dealing with what's there without being too stiff and overly skippy. But that's a character trait that you learn to lean on. And once you lean on it, and actually importantly through it, that's when this car comes alive. It settles. The lateral grip and the chassis stiffness gives you so much confidence, but in order to reach it, I find you do have to push through a threshold which, just for a moment there, feels mildly disconcerting. The result of that is that it's a car that excites you and does keep you on your toes, because at higher speeds, it is a little bit intimidating. And let's just talk about the way it looks. Now, the SLS AMG, the regular version of this car, wasn't exactly boring. This thing, well, in the words of Spinal Tap, they've turned it up to 11. It's so aggressive and imposing. I was doing some tracking shots with this earlier, and even though I was filming it, I wanted to get out of the way of it. It's so aggressive. One of the more defining features of the car... Just a second, I'm self-indulging. Oh, that front, honestly, that front end is marvellous. Actual Spitfire with number plates. God, this thing's good. It's cool that they only made 150, but equally it's really sad because they're really expensive now. And as I've said with other modern classics that I've driven recently, this series is becoming a real issue for me because I want all of them, all of the above. Engineers need to jump in some of the cars that I've driven recently and just be like, oh yes, remember when we made those things? What a car! Anyway, what was I saying about it looking good? Yes, imposing, aggressive, looks fantastic. One of the defining features that makes this car stand out, of course, from the standard SLS AMG is the massive carbon wing. That's another huge carbon component, which, okay, is in addition to this car, but still contributes to substantial downforce on the back of the car, but also looks dramatic and cool. And that's one of the standout features of the SLS Black Series. There is, of course, carbon everywhere, massive splitter, aggressive carbon bonnet, which I spoke about earlier. Yeah, it's a pretty serious thing, this. And on the inside, to support you when you're experiencing that lateral grip that I was speaking about earlier, is of course the carbon bucket seats. Now these are fixed, and unlike some fixed carbon buckets, they've got these right. The angle of them is spot on. They are pretty upright, like a GT3 car, but I've not once thought I could just do with adjusting these. There's just the right amount of lean to make it comfortable on a journey, but sporty enough that when you get on it, you're involved in the game. And the steering, none of your electric arty-farty stuff around here. This is hydraulically assisted steering, and just on a different level of steering feel and feedback as a result of it. You forget, actually, once you've spent some time in the world of electronically assisted steering, you get back in the old school and it's just gorgeous. So what don't I like about this car? That I don't own one? That's a big negative in my book. I don't have one of these, therefore I'm really annoyed about the whole situation. It's quite big on the road, and that's coming from somebody who regularly drives an F12 TDF. That car as well is fairly imposing, but what this car doesn't have is the witchcraft of rear wheel steering, which is such a massive evolution in the dynamics and handling of cars. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't a slouch by any means, but when you have such a long wheelbase, rear wheel steering does help the car shrink around you. When you become familiar with the footprint of this, it's okay, but it's a big boy. It is a big car. And when you're going down our tight, twisty British B roads, which is where all of the great driving roads are in England, sometimes you do have that breathe in, even when like a Volkswagen Polo drives past, you're like, woo! And there we have it. The monstrous, monumental, incredibly rare SLS AMG Black Series. 150 worldwide, just 15 right-hand drive cars, 11 in the UK, 6.2 litre naturally aspirated V8 from AMG, fettled by the guys at HWA, resulting in a bridging product between road car and GT3 racing car. And I know we hear these things time and time again, it's like a race car for the road, but this is one of those rare occasions where you truly can feel that DNA. And that element alone makes this a true modern classic. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I shall see you next time. Ciao!